Picture this. It's 3 in the morning on the Wyoming plains, 1882. The temperature has plummeted to 15 degrees below zero. The wind cuts through the darkness like a knife, and the nearest town is 2 days' ride away. A lone cowboy pulls his thin blanket tighter around his shoulders, knowing that falling asleep might mean never waking up again. Yet somehow, thousands of men and women survived these brutal nights in the American frontier, night after night. For decades. How did they do it? And why did so many of them actually prefer sleeping under the stars to the warmth of a proper bed? The answer to this mystery reveals one of the most fascinating and overlooked survival stories in American history. Tonight, we're going to uncover the ingenious, desperate, and sometimes deadly methods that kept people alive through the harshest nights the Wild West had to offer. When we think of the Wild West, we picture gunfights at high noon and dust clouds kicked up by galloping horses. But the real enemy wasn't outlaws or hostile territories. It was the cold, and it killed more people than all the shootouts combined. Consider the numbers that most history books don't tell you. Between 1860 and 1890, exposure to cold weather claimed the lives of an estimated 12,000 settlers, cowboys, and travelers across the Western territories. That's more than double the number killed in famous battles like Little Bighorn or Wounded Knee. Yet these deaths happened quietly, one frozen body at a time, scattered across a landscape that stretched from Kansas to California. The challenge wasn't just the temperature, though that was brutal enough. Winter nights in places like Montana and Wyoming regularly dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. The real problem was the combination of factors that made sleep a dangerous gamble. Sudden weather changes that could turn a mild evening into a deadly blizzard within hours, the complete absence of shelter for hundreds of miles, and the simple fact that most people heading west were completely unprepared for what they were walking into. But here's where the story gets interesting. Despite these impossible conditions, entire communities of people not only survived, but developed sophisticated systems for staying warm that modern survival experts still study today. They turned the act of sleeping into a science, and some of their methods were so effective that they actually preferred outdoor sleeping to indoor beds. Let's start with the most iconic figure of the frontier, the cowboy. Popular culture shows us men in thin shirts and leather vests, but the reality was far more complex. Professional cowboys developed what amounted to a portable survival system that they carried everywhere they went. The foundation of this system was the bedroll, but not the simple blanket most people imagine. A proper cowboy's bedroll was actually a carefully engineered piece of equipment. It started with a piece of canvas, usually about 18 feet long and 8 feet wide. This wasn't ordinary canvas, but a heavy, tightly woven material that had been treated with linseed oil or pine tar to make it waterproof. Inside this canvas shell went layers of specific materials, each chosen for a particular purpose. The bottom layer was typically a piece of oilcloth or rubber sheeting to protect against ground moisture. On top of that went wool blankets, but not just any wool blankets. Cowboys preferred what they called Navajo blankets, thick, tightly woven pieces that had been traded from Native American tribes. These blankets had a unique weave that trapped air while still allowing moisture to escape, preventing the deadly buildup of condensation that could freeze a person from the inside out. But the real secret weapon was something called a sugan. This was a comforter made from pieces of old quilts, clothing, and any other fabric that could be sewn together. Cowboys would spend their winter downtime creating these personal survival cocoons, and a well-made sugan could mean the difference between life and death on a cold night. The entire system could be rolled up and tied behind a saddle, weighing about 40 pounds. When properly deployed, it created what was essentially a one-person tent that could keep a person warm in temperatures that would kill someone sleeping indoors without proper heating. While cowboys get most of the attention, some of the most remarkable survival stories come from the women of the frontier. And their methods were often more sophisticated than those of their male counterparts. Take the case of Martha Somerville, a widow who homesteaded alone in North Dakota in 1881. Her diary, discovered in a farmhouse basement in 1987, reveals survival techniques that were passed down through networks of frontier women, but were never recorded in official histories. Somerville describes something she calls body banking, a method where women would heat stones by their fires during the evening, then wrap them in cloth and place them strategically in their beds. But the technique went beyond simple hot water bottles. She wrote about calculating the exact size and type of stone needed to retain heat for different lengths of time, and how to position multiple stones to create zones of warmth that would last until morning. Even more ingenious was her breathing tent system. Using scraps of fabric and animal hides, she created a small enclosure around her head and shoulders that would trap her exhaled breath, creating a pocket of warm, humid air. This prevented the dangerous heat loss that happens when you breathe cold air all night long. But perhaps the most remarkable technique was something frontier women called communal warming. In settlements where families lived in close quarters, women developed elaborate sleeping arrangements that maximized body heat sharing while maintaining privacy and safety. These weren't just practical arrangements. They were social systems that helped isolated communities survive the psychological challenges of frontier life as much as the physical ones. Long before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes had perfected the art of cold weather survival. Their methods were so effective that smart settlers quickly began adopting and adapting these techniques, though they rarely acknowledged where they learned them. The Lakota people developed what they called the breath lodge system for winter sleeping. This involved creating a small, semi-enclosed space using buffalo hides and wooden poles. The key innovation was the way they managed airflow. Instead of trying to seal out all cold air, they created carefully controlled ventilation that prevented carbon dioxide buildup while maintaining warmth. But the real genius was in their understanding of ground insulation. The Lakota knew that the earth itself was a source of heat loss, so they developed sophisticated methods for creating barriers between their bodies and the frozen ground. They would dig shallow depressions and line them with layers of pine boughs, dried grasses, and animal fur. This created what modern scientists now recognize as an incredibly effective insulation system. The Cheyenne took a different approach, focusing on what they called heat banking. During the day, they would build fires on spots where they planned to sleep that night. The fire would heat the ground several feet down, and then they would cover the area with hides and soil. Hours later, when it was time to sleep, the ground would still be radiating heat upward. These techniques were so effective that when blizzards struck, Native American camps often had zero casualties from cold exposure, while nearby military outposts or settler camps might lose dozens of people to the same storm. Nothing tests survival systems quite like extreme conditions, and the winter of 1888 provided one of the most severe tests in American frontier history. What became known as the Great Blizzard of 1888 caught thousands of people across the Great Plains completely off guard. The storm began on January 12th with temperatures in the 40s, warm enough that many children went to school without heavy coats. By afternoon, The temperature had dropped 60 degrees, and winds were gusting over 70 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to zero, and people became lost trying to travel distances of just a few hundred feet. This was when all those survival techniques were put to their ultimate test, and the results revealed some surprising truths about who really knew how to survive in extreme conditions. Take the story of the Kaufman family, German immigrants who had homesteaded in Nebraska just 2 years earlier. When the storm hit, they were caught in their barn, nearly half a mile from their house. Using techniques they had learned from a Pawnee woman who worked on a neighboring farm, they created a survival shelter using hay bales, horse blankets, and their own body heat. They survived 3 days in the barn, while the temperature outside dropped to 47 degrees below zero. Meanwhile, just 10 miles away, a group of experienced cowboys who had been caught in the open weren't as fortunate. Despite having proper bedrolls and years of frontier experience, they made critical errors in their survival strategy. They tried to keep moving to stay warm, rather than creating a shelter and conserving energy. By the time the storm passed, 4 of the 6 men had died from exposure. The difference wasn't in the equipment or even the experience. It was in understanding the psychology of extreme survival. The Kaufman family stayed calm and focused on creating the best possible shelter with available materials. The cowboys panicked and made decisions based on fear rather than knowledge. As railroads pushed west in the 1860s and 1870s, they created unique challenges for cold weather survival. Thousands of workers lived in temporary camps that moved every few weeks. Following the railroad construction, these men couldn't carry elaborate bedroll systems, but they couldn't rely on permanent shelters either. The solution they developed was both ingenious and controversial. Railroad companies began providing what they called communal warming cars. These were modified freight cars with holes cut in the floor and sides. Workers would build fires underneath the cars during the evening, heating the metal floors. Then they would sleep directly on these heated surfaces, using minimal bedding. The system worked, but it was dangerous. Records from the Union Pacific Railroad show that while deaths from exposure dropped dramatically, accidents from burns and carbon monoxide poisoning increased. Workers would sometimes wake up with serious burns from the heated metal, or not wake up at all if ventilation was poor. But the railroad camps also produced some of the most innovative survival techniques of the era. Workers developed methods for using railroad materials as insulation, creating windbreaks from railroad ties, and even fashioning heated clothing using small metal containers filled with coals from the fires. One technique that spread throughout the frontier was called coal pocketing. Workers would fill small metal containers with glowing coals and sew them into specially designed pockets in their coats and pants. This created portable heating that could last for hours, and the technique was quickly adopted by travelers, cowboys, and settlers throughout the West. Not every story has a happy ending, and understanding the failures is just as important as celebrating the successes. Frontier records are filled with accounts of people who had all the right equipment and knowledge, but still died from exposure. And their stories reveal the thin line between life and death in extreme conditions. One of the most tragic cases involved the Henderson Party, a group of 9 prospectors who froze to death in Colorado in 1879, despite having extensive cold weather gear and experience. Investigation of their campsite revealed that they had made a series of small errors that compounded into a fatal situation. They had chosen their campsite in what seemed like a protected valley, but they hadn't recognized signs of what mountain people call a cold sink, an area where cold air settles and becomes trapped. The temperature in their camp was actually 15 degrees colder than areas just a few hundred feet away. They had also made the mistake of eating a large meal before going to sleep, thinking it would help keep them warm. But the digestive process actually diverts blood flow away from extremities, making the body more susceptible to frostbite. Several of the men showed signs of severe frostbite to hands and feet, suggesting they had been slowly losing the ability to maintain their survival systems throughout the night. But the most critical error was psychological. When the first man showed signs of severe hypothermia, the group made the decision to share body heat by having everyone sleep in a single large bedroll system. This decision, which seemed logical and compassionate, actually accelerated heat loss for the entire group and may have turned what could have been a single casualty into a complete disaster. Modern research has revealed just how sophisticated many of these frontier survival techniques actually were. When scientists study historical methods for cold weather survival, they often find that frontier people had discovered principles that wouldn't be formally understood for another century. For example, the cowboy practice of creating layered bedroll systems actually employed what scientists now call thermal regulation through microclimate control. By creating multiple air gaps between different materials, they were managing convection, conduction, and radiation heat loss in ways that modern sleeping bag manufacturers have only recently begun to understand. The Native American technique of ground heating was actually an early form of thermal mass heating, a principle that's now used in modern sustainable building design. By heating large masses of earth or stone during the day and then using that stored heat at night, they were creating highly efficient heating systems that required no ongoing fuel input. Even more remarkable was their understanding of humidity management. Many frontier survival systems included ways to control moisture levels in sleeping areas, preventing both the hypothermia that comes from sleeping in damp conditions and the dehydration that can result from breathing extremely dry air all night. Scientists who have tested reconstructed frontier bedroll systems have found that they can maintain core body temperature in conditions that would be fatal for someone using modern canting equipment designed for much milder conditions. Some of the most interesting aspects of frontier survival involve techniques and stories that didn't make it into official histories, either because they were considered too controversial or because they challenged accepted ideas about how survival should work. One of the most debated theories involves the role of alcohol in cold weather survival. Official histories generally condemned the use of alcohol on the frontier, portraying it as a vice that led to poor decision-making and increased danger. But some modern researchers argue that controlled alcohol consumption may have actually been an effective survival tool in specific circumstances. The theory is based on alcohol's effect on blood vessel dilation. In extremely cold conditions, the body's natural response is to constrict blood vessels in extremities, which can lead to frostbite. Small amounts of alcohol can counteract this constriction, maintaining blood flow to hands and feet. Several documented cases suggest that people who consumed moderate amounts of alcohol before sleeping in cold conditions had lower rates of frostbite than those who abstained completely. However, this theory remains highly controversial because alcohol also impairs judgment and can mask the early warning signs of hypothermia. Most survival experts today still recommend avoiding alcohol in cold weather survival situations. Another controversial area involves the role of certain plants and herbs in cold weather survival. Frontier people, particularly those who learned from Native American tribes, used various plant preparations that they claimed helped them stay warm. Some of these involve teas made from pine needles, willow bark, or other local plants. Modern research has found that some of these plants do contain compounds that can affect circulation and metabolism in ways that might help with cold weather survival. But this research is still in early stages, and it's difficult to separate genuine physiological effects from placebo effects or coincidence. As the frontier period ended and the West became more settled, the survival techniques developed during the harsh early years didn't disappear. Instead, they evolved and adapted to new circumstances, influencing everything from military cold weather doctrine to modern outdoor recreation. Many techniques that were developed by cowboys and settlers were formally adopted by the U.S. military during World War I and World War II. The layered bedroll system became the basis for military sleeping bag design, and ground insulation methods developed on the frontier influenced military cold weather training programs. The communal warming strategies used by frontier women influenced the design of civilian emergency shelters and disaster relief protocols. Even today, emergency management agencies use principles first developed in frontier communities for keeping large numbers of people warm in temporary shelters. But perhaps the most interesting evolution was in the realm of psychology. Frontier people had developed not just physical techniques for surviving cold nights, but mental techniques for managing the fear and stress of extreme survival situations. They understood that panic and despair could be just as deadly as low temperatures, and they developed cultural practices and rituals that helped people maintain psychological stability during extended periods of hardship. These psychological techniques influenced everything from modern wilderness therapy programs to military survival training. The understanding that survival is as much mental as physical, first developed by people sleeping under the stars in the American West, continues to save lives today. Today, when we can buy sleeping bags rated for temperatures that would have terrified frontier settlers, it's easy to assume that modern technology has made all those old techniques obsolete. But that assumption would be wrong. Every year, modern hikers, campers, and outdoor enthusiasts find themselves in survival situations where high-tech equipment fails and old-fashioned knowledge makes the difference between life and death. Search and rescue teams regularly report cases where people survived extreme conditions by falling back on techniques that haven't changed since the 1800s. The layered insulation systems developed by cowboys are still more versatile than many modern sleeping bags because they can be adjusted piece by piece as conditions change. The ground insulation methods used by Native American tribes are still more effective than many modern sleeping pads because they're based on principles of thermal mass rather than just air gaps. But perhaps most importantly, the frontier understanding of survival as a total system, involving physical preparation, mental readiness, and community support, remains more comprehensive than most modern survival training. The people who learned to sleep safely in the Wild West understood something that we sometimes forget. Survival isn't about having the best equipment or the most advanced technology. It's about understanding your environment, adapting to changing conditions, and maintaining the mental clarity to make good decisions under pressure. So we return to our original question. How did they survive those brutal nights in the Wild West without freezing? The answer, as we've seen, involves a combination of ingenious techniques, hard-won knowledge, and remarkable human adaptability. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, something that doesn't appear in any survival manual or historical record. It's the simple fact that most of these people had no choice but to figure it out. They couldn't retreat to heated homes or call for rescue. They had to learn to sleep safely in impossible conditions because the alternative was death. That necessity drove innovation in ways that comfort never could. It forced people to pay attention to details that others might ignore, to experiment with techniques that others might consider too risky, and to develop a level of environmental awareness that was literally a matter of life and death. In our modern world, where we can control our environment with the flip of a switch, we've gained comfort, but perhaps lost something important. We've lost the deep knowledge of how to work with natural systems rather than against them, how to find warmth in cold places, and how to create safety in dangerous situations using nothing but intelligence, preparation, and determination. The next time you're lying in a warm bed on a cold night, remember those cowboys, settlers, and frontier families who learned to find comfort under an endless sky. Their techniques kept them alive, but their spirit of adaptation and resilience offers lessons that go far beyond survival. What other forgotten knowledge lies buried in our past, waiting to be rediscovered? And what challenges in our future might require the same combination of innovation and determination that helped people sleep safely through the coldest nights the Wild West had to offer? Perhaps the most important lesson from the frontier isn't about staying warm at all. Perhaps it's about the remarkable human capacity to adapt, innovate, and survive in conditions that seem impossible, as long as we're willing to learn from our environment and from each other. The stars that shone down on those frontier camps still shine today. The techniques that kept people alive through impossible nights are still there for us to learn. The question is, are we still willing to listen to what the wilderness has to teach us? If this journey into frontier survival has sparked your curiosity about the hidden stories of the American West, you'll want to explore more of the forgotten techniques and remarkable people who shaped our history. There are countless other mysteries waiting to be uncovered, from the secret languages used by frontier women to the lost navigation methods that guided travelers across unmarked territories. The wilderness holds more secrets than we could explore in a lifetime, but each one offers lessons that remain relevant to our lives today.